I got the one I wanted. All right, so we're starting this recording. Where are we? Here we go. Share screen. Okay, besides new members and new baptizees, people that had been excluded from communion because they were grievous sinners could be restored after a period of preparation. And the only time they'd wear sackcloth and throw ashes on themselves and really look penitent. So Easter was also the preferred day for restoration. So thus the baptizers, the candidates for membership, grievous sinners, and anybody publicly admitting to be sinners could all use a period of fasting for preparation. So this became a fairly common custom early on. See if I can get this going again. Now what's going on? Okay, I'm going to stop this for just a minute. Sorry for these problems I'm having. For screen. Show. Okay. I see let me back up. So public penance by grievous sinners and so forth began dying out about the 9th century. So instead of making a real show of how penitent you were, it became a custom for just the faithful to remind each other about the need for penance by a little ash on their forehead. Okay. This thing appears in Facebook every once in a while. Ideas about how to make the ash sign on your forehead. So the first in line gets a nice, good-looking cross there. Later on, they don't get a little hasty. There's the hasty one. Passive revenge, somebody who thinks really needs this. Okay. The hipster. There's the eye priest. This should probably be low toner.
Can we have a further discussion about this? These are hilarious.
Yeah. Talking about Ash Wednesday every year, some wag puts this on Facebook. So I thought, I'm keeping that. I'm using that.
All that's missing here is Matisse's La Femme.
Is what?
Matisse has a famous line drawing. I believe the title is La Femme, and it's, I believe, only 3 lines. And it comes like, anyway, it's tasteless. I shouldn't have said it. But
Well, we'll put you back on mute then.
I kind of like the mini. The eye praise is kind of funny. Okay, well, there's that. Okay, so Lent, we've said before, is a time of preparation, anticipating the joy of Easter, giving gratitude for the gift of forgiveness that comes with Easter, and desiring a closer spiritual connection with Christ. Okay. So the idea is to see you more clearly, love you more dearly, follow you more nearly day by day, right? Remember the song? Everybody remember? That's sort of the idea. Then, now we have this nice kind of kumbaya idea of what Lent is about. All this wonderful preparing for Easter. It's going to be a wonderful, glorious day. Along came about AD 1350, the Black Death or the Black Plague or the bubonic plague, most deadly pandemic in recorded human history. There were some estimates of 75 million, some up as high as 200 million deaths in Western Europe and Northern Africa. I think some places even in the Near East. Mainly between 1346 and 1353, although there were episodes of this coming back clear into about, I think, the beginning of the 1900s or the 1800s, 19th century. Let's see. So people definitely perceive the plague as punishment for the sins of the people. That's like the Jewish guys might have thought things in the Old Testament. So the emphasis for Lent became more on penitence. What did I do here? More on contrition, penitence, confession, just generally grieving. Okay, that became more of the thought. But that's something we'd like to get away from, at least in the Protestant part of the world. Okay, so there are both corporate and individual expressions of this, and some desperation came with it. So that's kind of the picture we get of Lent in the popular media, popular expressions and books and stuff. But really, we can be happier about it. So what about Reformed churches? What we've talked about mostly was before the Reformation. What happened when the Reformation movements came about? Well, John Calvin called Lent a superstitious observance. He thought it was pretty obnoxious stuff. There's Westminster Assembly in 1644 and the Scottish Parliament the next year. They proclaim that the only holy day in the gospel is the Lord's Day, the Christian Sabbath. No, Sunday is good enough for us. That's all we need. We don't need these special other seasons for things. I don't think they even liked Christmas. There's a painting of the Westminster Assembly. Some artist renditions, they all look like Puritans. That was just how they dressed back then. So Reformed churches historically did not observe Lent way back then. I'm not sure when it started coming back really good. I think most of our lifetimes we've seen some expression of it since the mid-20th century, at least maybe before. You know, people started observing Ash Wednesday, doing Lenten kind of things. So today, Roman Catholics also are kind of changing a little bit. Roman Catholics and some others, they abstain from meat on Fridays during Lent. You know, they used to be Friday always, but now it's just during Lent. And they usually give up something. Some other ideas that float around. Some spiritual renewal or some self-discipline. Getting back together with the family that you've been estranged with. Reading the Bible or some other spiritual authors, spiritual writing, and community service. Okay. These are ideas of how to observe Lent. And I looked in the Presbyterian USA Book of Order, and the only mention of Lent there are these two things. So one of the seasons we use to measure time. So sure enough, you look at the official church calendar that churches all get. There's a season of Lent, just like Advent and Pentecost and so forth. It's one of the seasons that kind of mark the year. And it's also said to be one of the seasons that shape household worship and personal life. So they recommend it for our personal observance. What happened? I went backward. Why is it called Lent? I think I gave you this last time. The name comes from some Germanic roots referring to lengthening of days.
Mm.
In Old English, there's this word lecton, meaning a spring season, which is when days get longer. The Dutch cognate, Lente. Old Dutch, it says Lenten. Old German, Lenzo. I think if you pronounce that in a Germanic kind of way, you actually can get a little bit of a T sound in there. So that's how it comes. Stuff I read gave you this Greek word, Sarakoski, meaning 40th. That's what I know. So that's where the word, that's as much as we know about where the word comes from. Just when is Lent? Well, in Western churches and Eastern churches are a little different. And there are even some variations on this on some denominations. Most of our Western churches, it starts Ash Wednesday, goes through Holy Saturday, the day before Easter. It's 40 days, not counting Sundays. So if you do the math, that takes you back to Ash Wednesday. Eastern churches, they have what they call Clean Monday, and they observe Lent through the Friday before what they call Lazarus Saturday, which is the day before Palm Sunday. Okay, the day before Jesus did a triumphal entrance into Jerusalem. Okay. And they also have 40 days, but they include Sundays. So if this is confusing enough, you know, their Easter is usually a week later than ours. So when this shapes out in this year, is the Western Lent is February 22nd through April 8th, the day before Easter. Whereas the Eastern observance is February 27th, it actually starts a little bit later, through April 7th, which is a Friday. And then our Easter is April 9, theirs is April 16. So they have like a week between Lent and Easter when they observe all the days of Holy Week. That's how the math works out.
So can you say, Michael, can you say that again? So in the Eastern tradition, it starts, because April is later, it starts later. But what happens between April 7 and April 16?
Well, they have Holy Week. April, April 7th is a Friday, then they have what they call Lazarus Saturday. Then they have their Palm Sunday and all the same events of the Easter week that we do.
But it's not considered part of Lent, though.
No. Different. I think they still do some fasting, but it's not considered part of Lent. Jan and I were in Greece a few years ago on for Easter time. In fact, we got there, I think, Palm Sunday, which was, our Easter. And we were on this cruise ship the night before Easter, Easter Eve. And right at midnight, all the Greek passengers made a beeline for the dining room where they had a big meal to break fast. That was a pretty big deal. So we, of course, went with them.
They laden all their little chapels and their churches with gobs and gobs and gobs of fresh flowers during that week. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning.
Mm.
It's a huge deal.
Anyway, that's when I just said, don't worry about writing all this down, by the way. I'll send you these the PowerPoint.
I'm curious, where were you in Greece? In the south and the
Mostly south.
Mm.
Athens, Corinth,
Mm.
some of the islands went over to Ephesus one day.
They also shoot off fireworks. You know, they know how to do it.
They do. So here's a reminder from last week. Lent is a season of preparation for letting God into your life and prepare you for a better understanding of Easter. Okay, makes sense?
Mm.
Mm. There's one more reason that we have to mention. Some of you have seen this. We can't let the extroverts have all the holidays.
So what does that mean?
Well, most of the observances are kind of quiet things.
Oh,
So that's the historical tidbits part of them tonight.
Mm.
So before we move on to spiritual practices, any questions, insights, puzzlements, joys?
I'm just curious, as a practical matter, do we know what constituted the practices of Lent during those early days? I mean, the fasting wasn't not eating anything or drinking anything for 40 days. So what was the practice? Do you know?
Well, I think some of them would look kind of would look really amazing to us. I think there was self-flagellation, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
But I think mainly fasting is about what I read about. Probably people did more prayers. They probably did more confessions.
Mm.
Confessions might have begun from this. Okay. Well, let me stop sharing for a minute in case anybody wants to offer any other.
Just a tidbit. When I first started to serve at Kenilworth, and we were coming up on Ash Wednesday, I wanted to make sure we had sufficient ashes to do the imposition of ashes. And there's a big apostolic church not far from us in Southeast Portland, and there was a Christian gift shop that was across from that campus, although I think they were primarily organized by the Catholic Church. So I went in there and asked if I could buy some ashes. And boy, did they put me through the interrogation. And I evidently I passed because they sold me some in a little packet, but it wasn't like they were going to sell those ashes to anybody off the street, let anybody just off the street, because for them it was, well, sacred in that sense, and that it maybe their supply was limited and they just wanted to make sure that it was going to a good home. But and of course and I don't know if we touched on this or if you picked this up from other experiences, but ashes are traditionally understood to be the remainder of when you burn the palms from Palm Sunday,
Yeah.
and you retain those ashes and use them for Ash Wednesday. Well, if that hasn't happened, or like in the case of Kenilworth, we've had a parishioner that was allergic to palms, and so we started to use artificial palms. So we didn't have anything to create ashes from. But the last thing, and Michael, if you ever get into a circumstance where you're doing the imposition of ashes, if you haven't already, it's a good idea to have a damp cloth up by the table or wherever you're working from, because I can remember my first year doing that. My thumb and index finger were really quite full of ashes, and I needed to pick up the Bible and or the hymn book or whatever, and all I could think of is wiping my hands on my pants. So it is good to have something to wipe the ashes off when you're done. Those are my 2 tidbits as your mentor. Make sure you have a cloth to wash your hands after,
Good advice.
and don't run out of ashes.
See, by the way, that our son Peter has joined us.
I
So,
beat
good.
Peter.
All right, any other thoughts or
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Peter.
any other spiritual utterances you have about Lent?
That makes it sound very official if we utter
Yeah.
something to you.
I want to say that where we lived in Ohio, it was in a very Catholic community, and they were all busy. Of course, they had fish fries every Friday night as fundraisers for their school, but they were all very busy with their giving up something for Lent. And I can remember our church emphasizing that as Protestants or as Reformed Christians, we didn't really believe in giving up, but taking on more. And when you were doing your history, it talked about giving alms to the poor and community service. And that was what our church focused on during Lent, was taking up something that we hadn't been doing before, maybe a spiritual practice.
Yeah, that's
or
a nice lead into that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm leading into his next thing. Okay.
You are. Very good.
Anyway, when my friends were giving up chocolate or whatever for Lent, I was busy taking on another project. So I always felt, I don't know, maybe had a little halo. I shouldn't talk about it.
Well, you might say you're giving up time.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. I hadn't thought of it that way. Thank you, Michael.
Well, I have to ask you, where in Ohio, Becky?
At that point, we were living in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, we lived in a little town called North Royalton, and we went to church in Parma.
Cleveland's very ethnic.
Oh, yes, extremely. Yes, we loved all the ethnicities in town.
So a third of the congregation at one point were former Catholics,
Oh.
most of whom had encountered divorce in their life.
Oh.
Let's get back to our.
Yeah.
Yes, let's get back to Lent.
Sorry.
I can get this moving again. Okay, let's talk about some spiritual practices. You've heard phrases like spiritual formation, spiritual discipline, spiritual practices. These are perspectives on a similar idea. The idea is to know your true self and become closer to God. There's this guy, Evagrius of Ponticus, who lived back in the 4th century. He said the goal of life is to know God, not to know about God. Okay, make sense? You want to actually meet God. You don't want to just read about him in some funny books or something. You know, you want this to be a real knowledge of God. This guy, Robert Mulholland, is kind of an expert in modern times. He came up with this phrase: the spiritual formation is a process of being formed in the image of Christ for the sake of others. This wasn't totally original with him. He added the phrase "for the sake of others" to give some accountability to it. Okay. He pointed out that a lot of times spiritual formation is seen as something that you add on to your personality that solves all your problems. He says that's sort of like telling somebody with both legs broken, you just need to get up and run more. That's going to cure your broken legs. He says our spirituality is not something added on, it's really the very essence of our being. We are spiritual beings. We have emotions and everything. That's all that is the incarnation of our spiritual life. And there's a reference to where all this comes from. So, being formed in the image of Christ. Next thing you know is that Jesus looked at people. It's interesting to notice that how many times in the Gospel it says he looked at somebody, that he really, of course, knew them. Galatians 4, it says, now, however, that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? How can you be enslaved to them again? You know, how can you go back to that? You need to go forward, closer to God. You're not going to see others until you know how God sees you. What do you really believe God sees when he looks at you? When God sees you, does he want to fix you or does he want to love you? Okay. Not take a moment and answer that question for yourself. This business that you can't really see others until you know how God sees you. You know, we have this thing that says, love your neighbor like yourself. And I think when Jesus says that, he means something quite a bit more than we think he means. He means love your neighbor as I can empower you to love like I love you. Okay? You can't really know your neighbor and know how to love him until you see how God sees that person. Some of you, by the way, are becoming quite good at that. You won't even see others until you know how God sees you. Now back to a little bit of history. Bernard of Clairvaux, back in the 12th, or what was that? Mostly the 12th century, I guess. He said there are 4 degrees of love. First degree, where we all start out, is kind of self-love. It's been part of us since the beginning. And the second degree, when you advance a little bit, is to love God for your own sake. This is just self-preservation. Because you're mindful that there's God out there. The third step is loving God for God's sake. You get there when you start to see how God loves others just as much as he loves you. Finally, you come to we love ourselves the same way that God does. Okay? That's the ubiquitous, uncreated kind of love. People call it sacrificial love, but that's just kind of scratching the surface. An uncreated love. So a lot of you have studied mystics. Through the centuries, mystics have explored ways to go through stages like that towards such love. And many of them have expressed their goal as unity with God. It strikes me as kind of a silly notion. You're not going to be one with God. You're not going to be the same as God. That would require everything to be kind of impersonal. And really, God is, I think we've said before, he's infinitely beyond our understanding. So you're never going to be really one with him in that kind of sense. But I think what they really mean is an intimate, perfected communion with God. You start to see things like God sees them. One of the best known examples of this is Teresa of Avila. This sculpture by Bernini. This is in a church in Rome, not the Vatican, but another church. Teresa here, she had a lot of visions. People that have read her autobiography, they say she might have had some kind of form of epilepsy. She thought there were times when she kind of levitated. She felt like she had. She asked people to hold her down. So that may have been what it was, but still, visions legitimate for sure. She said this in one of her writings, says, I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, this angel that was in the previous picture. And at the point, there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love for God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. Let me go back to that. So basically, she's saying she was kind of in a trance, and this angel was piercing her with darts of love. That's how she felt God's love coming to her. So it can be that dramatic. So Lent is the season that encourages us to meet God in all places, hamlets, and layers of our lives. It might not be as dramatic as Teresa, but you can get quite close to God these ways. Spiritual practices can help us. So what are some of these? You might be asking yourselves. Well, I'll send you out a little handout that I've got that lists a lot of stuff and some readings you can go to get some of this. The classic one nowadays is Richard Foster, Celebration of Discipline. Here's a dozen or so that he describes quite extensively. He mentions others, but these are some of the main ones he dwells on. So these are kind of the classic ones: meditation, prayer, fasting, studying, living a simple life, making your life simple, solitude where you're free from meditation, so forth. And he mentioned service, of course. On the handout I'll send you has all these listed, so don't worry about writing them down. Some additional disciplines that other authors talk about. Just observing silence. Having fellowship. If you're an extrovert, you need that one. But more than actually, we all need that. Extroverts need it longer. Going on retreats. Giving is a good way. Discipline of Sabbath. So taking doesn't have to be the Sabbath, which is Saturday. It doesn't have to be the Lord's Day. It can be any day. But a regular observance where you have one day of real genuine rest. Still more that mentioned by people. Poetry, play, the kind of innocent, youthful play where everything is in the moment. Drawing, people like to draw things. Mindfulness, writing, or somewhere there's a, where do I have it? Journaling, it must be in here somewhere. Maybe it was in the previous one. Dance, yoga, learning to say no, protecting your time. And sometimes that's just being honest with people. Eye contact and seeing the divine in others, that's something we mentioned a little bit ago. Trying to see God in other people. What does God see in this other person? Having honest conversations. Difficult if you're on the autism spectrum, but the rest of you can do that. Storytelling. And just doing humble tasks. Okay, washing the dishes, ironing stuff. You can do like Brother Lawrence and just do these tasks do them with God in mind. Some of these look good. Anybody think of others? You might. It's probably infinite. You can go with. What we're going to talk about in weeks ahead. Next week, we're going to talk about Lectio Divina, how to really enjoy it. You've probably seen versions of this in different classes we've had. It's usually abbreviated. I think I'm going to try to give you the full, what's his name? Kind of started the Jesuits. I think he came up with the original design of Lectio Divina. I'm going to give you this full model, and which can be modified lots of ways. Spirit as the Spirit directs. Week 4 will get into some basic examine ideas, and examine is very much what it sounds like in English. You're examining your aptitude, your ability, your awareness of God's presence. You think about, when was I aware of that? How can I be more aware? We'll talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about a discernment examine that I came across a couple of months ago that looks really delicious. Spent some time on that. Then, if trying to go through all these kind of practices, trying to get there and figure out steps you can take that will get you closer to God, and it becomes frustrating for you, we're going to get to the cloud of unknowing that just basically parts all those clouds. It'll be a relief to all of you with trying to find a spiritual practice that fits you exactly. If that's bothering you, this cloud of unknowing will help you. It's one of the most amazing things ever. So we'll talk about that. And as usual, there will be a PowerPoint. Okay, what have I got here? Okay, last week, we gave you a homework assignment. I'm wondering if you did that. Okay. You were supposed to look at these 3 passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and note the differences. I have to admit here, I have to fess up, this is not a real well-formed assignment. because it depended on what translation you use. I discovered that. I was using the New Revised Standard, even the updated edition. And there was a difference that was quite apparent, but it turns out it's really just a translation thing, but we'll still get to something important about it. So what differences did you see? Anybody want to mention some? Well, perhaps we ought to look at what the passages were. Matthew 20 is this. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed. Two blind men by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they shouted, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd sternly ordered them to be quiet, but they shouted even more loudly, "Have mercy on us, Lord, Son of David." Jesus stood still and called them, saying, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Okay. So you got the basic story. Then Mark, they came to Jericho. He had the disciples, large crowd, leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus. So Mark knew the name. The blind beggar was sitting by the roadside. When he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." They called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up, came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. That's Mark. Luke. As he approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening, and they told him Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. Then he shouted, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Those who were in front sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he shouted even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, he asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" He said, "Lord, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight, your faith has saved you." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him, glorifying God, and all the people, when they saw it, they praised God. Okay. If you were reading the same translation I was, you got a lot of differences. I'll show you in a minute. What differences did you find? Anybody?
In going through it, one of the things that struck me was the manner of healing. In Matthew, Jesus touched the blind men,
Right.
And there was no mention of their faith. However, in Mark and Luke, he mentioned faith to both of those. In one, he said, "Go, your faith has made you well." And in Luke, he said, "Receive your sight, your faith has saved you."
Right.
And I thought that was interesting that in only one of the Gospels did he touch the people that he healed. The other two, it was simply by making a statement.
Mhm. Any others?
So in Matthew, it says two blind men.
Yeah, Matthew had two guys.
Hmm?
Matthew had two guys, yeah.
Yeah. Mark didn't.
And in Mark, the man was given a name. I thought that
Right.
was interesting.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why we think Mark is the older gospel. Is Mark kind of legend is that he was a companion of Peter, was through a lot of the time. And so he heard all of Peter's stories, and this Bartimaeus was known early on. And by the time the other gospels were written, perhaps the name had been forgotten. Yeah.
Another difference was in Matthew and Mark, Jesus and the crowd were leaving Jericho.
Mhm.
And in Luke, they were approaching. And I find that interesting because in Matthew and Mark, the blind men called out. They seemed to know that it was Jesus. But in Luke, because they were just approaching Jericho, perhaps Jesus, he hadn't done anything yet in Jericho, and therefore the blind man was not aware of who was there. Although when he heard who it was, he called out. But I thought it was interesting that two of them were leaving Jericho and one was approaching Jericho.
Yeah.
Well, I had an interesting experience. I have to admit, I only read one of them because I kept forgetting, and Mike was supposed to remind me.
Oh,
Anyway,
Sorry.
so Sunday night, I was in bed and I had been reading a novel, and I thought, this is not a good way to go to sleep with whatever I was reading. So on my nightstand, there's this daily bread thing that
Oh,
I don't know. It was lying there, and I just picked it up and opened it up. It was the Mark scripture, the
Hmm.
exact thing. I'm like, are you kidding? And the little title was asking for help. And so what it says was, Bartimaeus posed a question, and the question is stunning. It shows the healer, Jesus, longs to help us. But first, we're invited to admit needing him, a humble step. So Bartimaeus was needy indeed, poor, alone, possibly hungry, but wanting a new life. He simply told Jesus his basic need. And that's what the crux of this little devotion is. It was an honest plea. And what is, and so he says, so what do you need today? What is your basic need? And I just love that because it was so simple. And that's really stuck with me all week. What is it? What is it I need? What do you need to ask God for? And then he says, can you trust him to give you what you need? So it was like, wow, are you amazing?
Yeah, the first thing I did is I went through all three and I wrote down all the things that were the same. Because I think you need to see the similarities as well as the differences. And one of the things that struck me, and I know it's just a translation, but every single one, Jesus asked the same question.
Yes.
What do you want me to do for you? And I think he's asking us all that question too. But he, the words were exactly the same in all three verses, or all three scriptures.
I find that that model of Jesus asking we would think it was obvious, these were presented as blind people. And wouldn't it be obvious what they wanted Jesus to do? And the relevance to the things we would do in Christ's name for others is often based on what we think they need.
Mm.
And if we use this model, the first thing we ask is, what would you like us to do? And oftentimes we're surprised when we are in the presence of someone who has a need and we think we know what their need is and we think we know how to supply it or fix it. And to be open and curious, to ask the question, what would you like me to do? And I used that in my previous occupation. People would come to my office with sometimes very serious complaints. I can recall listening to someone, and what they described was truly horrible. And I thought, oh man, this is awful. And at the end of their time of listening on my part, I said, what would you like me to do? And they said, well, you've already done it. We just wanted someone to listen to us. So it was a great surprise, and it's a reminder that if we are working with folks that are in need, we need to ask them, what would you like me to do? The other one that I would mention here, and Michael, you touched on it, and that is the motif in Luke in particular, but I think it's present in the synoptics, and it's Jesus saw. Jesus sees people.
Mhm.
Oftentimes people are obscured by the crowd, but in this particular case, and it may in some sense have to do with each of these stories talks about the person in need doesn't have physical sight. They become aware of the presence of Christ by sounds, other senses, by people telling them what's happening. And so in each of these cases, the people in need saw in their own way, saw Jesus. And then Jesus would say, bring them to me. But it's an interesting variation on the theme that oftentimes Jesus would see a leper, or see he sees the lepers when the rest of the world would like them to be invisible. Jesus sees us, as you mentioned, Michael, and or God sees us. But in this case, it was as if the blind folks could see something that normal sighted people hadn't.
Yes, that's good. Well, let me show you some of the differences I saw. Some of the obvious ones, like we heard that Matthew and Mark is leaving Jericho and Luke is approaching Jericho. And in Matthew, there's two blind men. Mark, there's one guy and Mark knows his name. And Luke, there's just some blind guy. He doesn't have a name. Matthew, Jesus stood still and called them, the two of them. And that's in Matthew. In Mark has a lot of details about the reaction of the crowd. The crowd has more conversation with Bartimaeus, and he has a detail about his cloak and so forth. And in Luke, Jesus just stood still and ordered the man to be brought. Ordered either the crowd or his disciples or somebody to bring him forward. I think in all three of them, he said Jesus stood still.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the common deals. You stop, say, hey, somebody's calling me. Some more differences. Matthew, Lord, let our eyes be opened. Mark, my teacher, let me see again. Luke, Lord, let me see again. So Mark and Luke, at least in this translation, implied that the blind guy had not been born blind.
Yeah.
Matthew, as Becky said, Jesus touched the eyes of those two guys because of compassion. It mentions his compassion. Then Mark says, go, your faith has made you well. Luke, received your sight. Your faith has saved you. I'll make a bigger deal of that in just a minute. Matthew, immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Mark says he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Luke adds that they glorified God, and all the people, when they saw this, praised God. So the whole crowd got into it. So an important detail from Luke. Luke says, receive your sight because your faith has saved you. I think this gives us a clue that a lot of these conversations Jesus had with people that he healed, they're not always recorded for us. And even when they are, they're very condensed, they're very brief. If you see him, if you look really close, he's saying quite a bit more than just you've been healed. You know, go and don't tell anybody or something. You know, but Luke gave us this detail. It says you've been saved. So I think the idea here is Jesus didn't just fix people. He didn't just fix your owies. It wasn't just a drop-in healthcare clinic. He came to give them life. He came to save people. He's in the salvation business. And a lot of times, I think that's what he's really saying to people. Your faith has saved you. But this turns out to be a translation problem. Somebody said once that actually the word that means healing, made well, is the same as the word for saved. So it's translated some different ways. So I looked at different translations. The Revised Standard, both old and newer. It says made you well in Mark and saved you in Luke. New King James says made you well in Mark with a footnote that says it could be translated saved you. And in Luke, it has made you well. New Revised Standard just says healed you in both places. Sometimes I think the NIV takes kind of a simple way out. The New American Standard said made you well in Mark and made you well in both places. But as a footnote now in Luke, it says it may be translated saved you. The Common English Bible, the newer one, says healed you in both places. Then the Message, I looked at that. I actually looked at the Message this time. And Dean Peterson did the amazing thing. He said, let's give you both meanings. Your faith has saved and healed you. He uses that in both places. So Message fans, you can be very proud. Eugene Peterson really got this right. This paraphrasing kind of heals the translation issue. I definitely think that's what Jesus talked to people about when he healed them. And I think to help understand that, I look at the story about the paralytic being lowered down through the roof, through the ceiling. And if I had been Jesus, I would have said, okay, I would have tagged him and said, okay, you can walk now. And you and your friends fix the roof and get out of here. But Jesus just looked at him and said, son, your sins are forgiven. Totally surprising answer or response from him. And I think it's what he basically was saying, you've got life. I've given you life. And I think that's what he means. It's what he does to the penitent thief on the cross. It says, Lord, remember me. He says, yes, I commute your sentence from death to life. So you thought you were going to get off easy with this assignment. Well, I'm going to give you another homework. So some of you have already started asking this. Now Jesus looks at you. You might reread these three passages again and then think, okay, Jesus looks at you and asks, what do you want me to do for you? So I suggest you take a walk or go on a little retreat somewhere. Find your answer. Okay. If you want to share them with us next week, that's fine. But it'll be your personal project. I won't require you to answer.
Michael, I have one question about those three verses that's going to sound, I suppose, trite, but there's a substantial difference in the length.
All right.
Yeah, because I put them into parallel columns just to look at them together. And granted, I did it in Italian, but all right. Uh,
What?
We should ask you how that translates out there.
well, to be candid, I felt after I initiated this, I felt as though I was, it was a distraction because I ended up working more on Italian than I did on theological meaning, the intent, the theology of it. But I seldom read the Bible in English without reading it in Italian, and frequently only read it in Italian. And this started out as an exercise in, I figured if I was going to be serious about Italian, I should be serious about reading the most important book in Italian. So there, that was the thinking of it. But it turns out it's quite useful because if you, often what seems, I won't say inscrutable, but you kind of wonder just what they're getting at in our English translations. I seldom feel that way in Italian ones. I have no explanation for that. But I've got 3 different versions of Italian I look at. So it's they're all modern. Gene Peterson hasn't touched the Italians yet. But I don't know who his counterpart might be. But nonetheless, I'm stunned by the difference in length. And often when something's translated from English to Italian, it gets longer. English comes as shock is generally a fairly concise language.
Okay, well,
And Michael, it's interesting if you have these in parallel, that the longest of the 3 is Mark, who is generally known for his brevity.
Yeah.
So he spends a lot of ink and papyrus on this.
By the way, David, that holds up in Italian as well. Matthew is the shortest, Mark is the longest, and Luke is just probably a line or 2 shorter than Mark.
okay, let's stop sharing this. I'll share my other screen if I can find it.
So now I want to look at my Spanish Bible.
Huh. You have a Spanish Bible?
Yeah.
I have something that might actually be more serious that this really made me think about, Michael, and that is the whole issue of in this scripture, when you mention them passing the fellow through the roof, and the fact that Christ, as far as we know, Christ had no reaction to that at all. He just healed the guy. And I've often thought about that as the fact that that's not remarked upon as sort of an indication of Christ's expectation. Well, of course, you'd rip a hole in the roof and hand a guy down that needed healing because you're supposed to do what you need to do to help people. And I've always seen it sort of as an object lesson in get up off your butt and do what needs to be done to help the least among you. Anyway, whatever that's worth.
Okay. I'm trying to get my screen to cooperate. There we go. Oop, ah. What did I do here?
We can always talk among ourselves.
You can, yes. There we go.
Just say the word.
Okay, I'm just trying to enlarge this so it fills a lot of the screen but doesn't show us. Okay. So readings for this week. I can remember any of them. Okay, Genesis. Genesis 12 is where we see God's promise to Abraham or Abram. This is where he promises him he's going to make him a great nation, make your name great, you'll be a blessing. And the important part here for us is that in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Families is sometimes interpreted as nations and all peoples. So that's where this comes from. This is a frequent theme in the Old Testament. And in some of the New Testament writers as well. Psalm 121, we often hear this. It's about the idea that God is always with you. He's your real helper. He's never going to leave you. He's going to be there. Down to verse 8, he's going to keep you. You're both coming and going from now on forevermore. And you can count on him. So what does this mean for Lent? You can get close to God, you can count on him being there. Make sense? Romans. What do I think about this? We talked about the promise to Abraham. Paul's making the argument here that Abraham was not justified by his works. He couldn't boast about anything like that. He was justified because he believed God. Okay? It was reckoned to him as righteousness. Very famous verse, verse 3 here. Okay. The promise that he would inherit the world didn't come to Abraham because of the law. The law wasn't even there yet, but because of his righteousness of faith. If adhering to the law made all the difference, then the promise wouldn't mean anything. So Paul was pretty big on this, the faith of Abraham. Abraham would be the father of many nations. Gives life to the dead and calls to existence things that don't exist. So he's making an argument here that this applies to us. Okay. John 3, this is probably many of us heard this morning. Nicodemus comes to visit. And I think Nicodemus is often very underrated. If you look at the Gospel of John and kind of try to parallel it with some of the others, Nicodemus is really the first guy that Jesus actually feels like he can share something with him about why he's there, what he's come to accomplish, what's his purpose. A lot of this he doesn't let the apostles even know until quite a bit later, even after resurrection. So Nicodemus, I think, deserves more credit. He's a guy who came to Jesus and wanted to know more, as should we. Lent is a good time for approaching Jesus and saying, helping understand. And one of the things, by the way, that you can get out of this visit from Nicodemus, he says you must be born of flesh and of spirit. When you're born in the flesh, you don't do any of the work. Your mother does all of the work. She does all the pushing you out. Same with when you're born in the spirit. Jesus says a lot about how you don't know what the Spirit is doing. You don't know where he's coming from. You don't know where he's going. And being born by the Spirit, you don't know how that's going to happen, and you don't do it. It's all done by the Spirit. It's all the work of the Spirit. So it's all in here. Now, a lot of scholars, by the way, believe that the quote from Jesus ends with verse 15. And 16 and 17 are really editorial comments from John, whoever wrote John. Personally, I think it's John the Apostle, but whoever wrote this. Just wanted to make it really clear, what Jesus was saying, who he was, what he was doing. Verse 15, after all this, say that whoever believes in him will have eternal life. So 16 and 17 to say that again in different ways. So Lent is about coming closer to God and really realizing, who is this person that God created me to be? And because that's the person that's going to live forever, not the person that you make of yourself, but the person Christ makes of you. That's what's going to be everlasting. Matthew is the transfiguration. So from their experience, they go up there. Jesus gets very bright. It shows his face shines, his clothes become bright. Jesus and his executive committee, they see this, and they see Moses and Elijah. And Peter doesn't really know what to say. He's dumbfounded, but he blurts out something that, hey, how about we make some tents for you guys? Meanwhile, this voice from the cloud says, this is my son, the beloved, with him I'm well pleased, listen to him. Which is, of course, what we should do. Disciples heard this, they were just shocked by it, the fear of, what, my God, what is going on? Jesus came and touched them. Touching somebody that's afraid is a very good thing to do. And certainly Jesus does it quickly. Get up and do not be afraid. It was really just him. As they're coming down, they said, he told them, don't tell anybody about this till the Son of Man is raised. So again, a lot of the apostles, they're not ready to know any of this. Whereas Nicodemus got an early version of it. Okay. Very impressive. So, yes, you can come to God and find out a lot about his life for you. So that's a good Lenten reading too. Anybody else to read these things and have any thoughts about them? Well, here we are back. Looks like our son has left us. Okay. Well, tonight's lessons were a little meatier than most of them will be. And a lot to cover with the history and the spiritual gifts. And we're not going to get into a lot of detail on spiritual gifts. I think that could be several classes in itself. But we're going to get into a few of the better known ones and more commonly used ones, I think. Any other thoughts or imaginations or questions or puzzlements? prophecies.
But our homework, Michael, is to, for ourselves, answer the question, what do you want God to do for me? What do I want God to do for me?
Yes.
Is that right?
And it says Michael Talbert or whatever name he has for you. It says, what do you want me to do for you?
Maybe he has a nickname.
And he says he has a name for all of this. Somebody said,
Yeah, that's pretty.
Well, I have an alter ego, because in my class, this is the only time I've ever had a nickname, I mean, anyone's ever used in my life. And when we got to class in Italy, there was already a Michele before me. And so the teacher looked at me and said, okay, you'll be Massimo. And
okay.
Huh.
so it's not unusual to find things around here labeled Massimo. I have had other nicknames, but none would be appropriate to mention here. So that would be the other thing. So
Mhm.
they weren't terms of endearment.
So when I recorded this, remember I went on and off a few times. I saw there was an option to record it to the cloud. So I'm hoping I can do that and give you all a link to someplace so you can all get it. I got a recording on my own laptop here of last week, but it's too big to send to everybody. It's like 240 or 50 megabytes.
If you, Michael, if you save that to like your Google Drive, to a Google Drive, you know, it's on the cloud, right? So if you save it to a Google Drive, then you can send a link to everyone, giving them permission to go get it, and then they can get it that way.
The other thing you can do is to put it in YouTube, and you can make it private and only people that you give the link to have access to it. But I've done that for, 2 and 3 hour programs that we've done. So that's another possibility. Yeah, storing it on your computer isn't helpful.
No, YouTube. Oh,
YouTube,
oh, that's interesting.
Well, if this stuff's going on YouTube, I'm turning off my camera. I'm just that vain.
It's only for people that Michael gives
Okay.
the link to.
Or
Yeah,
those
but
that-
I have to trust Michael, you know what I'm saying? No, I'm just,
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, hadn't thought of that one.
Are you worried about too many followers or what?
no, no. I keep my concerns to myself.
Oh, that you might be found, is that it? Are you trying?
Just
Never
keep
mind.
it off of TikTok, Michael. As
Yeah.
soon as I figure out what TikTok is.
Yeah. If you find out, David, you can explain it to me. I have zero interest in. I don't have. When I click on something and it takes me to Facebook or something like, I think that's what it's called. I said, okay, I'm done. I just go on somewhere else. I don't have one of those. I don't go there. I don't want to know how. And I used to be in the computer business, right? But I just have zero. It's just a place I don't need to be.
So this went kind of long tonight, 1 hour and a half. So I don't mean to go that long every week. But this is meatier than most. So sorry about this. But,
Michael, bless you for doing this. Don't worry about it. Don't be. Nobody's damning you when you hang up, you know.
All right, well, let's close with a little prayer, then we can go home. Or go away.
Off the computer.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lord, for this time, for all these gracious people and the time they've given up to do this. Thank you for the many insights you give to us, for even Eugene Peterson seeing through this problem. And oh, Lord, help us to come closer to you daily, step by step. And help us to see through the clouds that get in the way and just the confusion we have about who you are. Lord, draw closer and let us know you better. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So see you all next week. Bring your friends.
Alrighty.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye-bye.
bye now.